Good morning. Good morning to you, Madam Chair, Representative Steinberg, Chair Steinberg, and distinguished members of the Public Health Committee. Thank you for the opportunity this morning to submit testimony on House Bill 5898. There are many reasons to oppose this proposed legislation. For a start, let's call it by its correct name, physician-assisted suicide. The American Medical Association, the body whose members would be responsible for carrying this out, continues to oppose this practice. It reiterates its opposition and says assisted suicide is fundamentally incompatible with a physician's role as a healer, would be difficult or impossible to control, and would pose serious societal risks. They recently convened their Council on Ethical and Judicial Affairs that did a 2-year study and again reached the same conclusion, that this was a path down which they, as an association, did not want to see their members go. Their review of the European experience showed that it began as physician-assisted suicide, and it soon morphed into not only allowing this to happen with terminally ill patients, but then patients who were suffering from depression, mental illness, elderly couples, and people who feared abandonment. In Belgium, children of the age of 12 are now permitted to request assisted suicide. Close to 25% of all the deaths in the Netherlands in 2017 were a result of physician-assisted suicide. Do we want to send the message that your life is not worth it? In Belgium and the Netherlands, organs are harvested post-physician-assisted suicide. What about the pressure the availability of assisted suicide places on people who are worried about the effect on their families? And I know my time is up. I just want to sum up. There are many reasons to oppose it. The unpredictability of the length of life, the fear that there will be coercion, and the need for the real access to palliative care, which can address so many of these fears and concerns. So again, I thank you so much for allowing me to testify today, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions or comments? Representative Steinberg?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative, for testifying today. I agree with you. I would hope that the vast majority of people who are in distress end of life would find that hospice or palliative care would be the right solution for them, and we have wonderful programs in the state, and people should be aware of those options, and hopefully there'll be sufficient access to them. What we're talking about here is different, and I will contend with your statement that this is akin to suicide. Suicide is often involving people who are depressed. If you read the bill carefully as we've intended it, certainly there are protections in place to make sure that is not the reason. I take your point, no one knows for certain length of life, but there are also issues with quality of life. But let me address one of the comments you made with regard to the medical community. Are you aware of the fact that the Connecticut State Medical Society is now neutral on this subject, recognized there's a lack of unanimity on the part of physicians in this state?
Yes, I am, but I don't feel it alters the essential nature of what's happening here. Being neutral to me is like maybe you're a little bit pregnant. You're not going to take a stand. To me, this is something, as I say, I find it hard to accept that you can be truly neutral on an issue like this. And maybe we would differ there, Representative.
I think the challenge is with any society, you have a variety of viewpoints. And I think changing their position is reflective of the fact that there's a change in general opinion among the physician community. So when you make a statement that the physician community is against it, I find it perhaps misleading, at least here in the state of Connecticut, in the state of Massachusetts, and in many other states. The medical community is now viewing it somewhat differently. So I just want to make sure that everybody's aware that, it's a challenge for medical societies of any nature to express a firm opinion, and it's becoming even more so in this context.
Well, I do appreciate that, and I'm sure there are differing views, but people decry the slippery slope argument. And I think if anything, the slippery slope argument applies here. In Canada, there are no longer conscience provisions. You are required to provide these services. And again, I'm not saying this is going to happen in Connecticut, and I just want to, so in the UK, which is a very different healthcare system, in large hospital settings, they found there was not a sufficient access to true palliative care at end of life. So they instituted something called the Liverpool Care Pathway. Well, for a variety of reasons, this care pathway, which was meant to be a really integrated end-of-life experience for patients in hospitals, morphed out of all recognition to what it was intended. They were seeing increasing use of continuous sedation for end of care in life, lack of consultation, not only with the patients, but with the patients' families. And having instituted it in 2003, it was ended. And I just want to sum up a research paper. And it says the most important lesson that can be learned from this is not about the dangers of scaling up clinical interventions. Rather, it is about the need for greater assessment of the wider risks involved and more careful consideration of the unintended consequences that might result from a given course of action, especially in the politically and morally charged arena of end-of-life care interventions. And I suppose that's what I'm asking here. Please let us be absolutely sure that we know what opening this Pandora's box will lead to. I mean, looking at the legislation, and it's Section 19, lines 76 through 79, terminal illness means the final stage of an incurable and irreversible medical condition that an attending physician anticipates within reasonable medical judgment will produce a patient's death within 6 months. Well, what if you're a type 1 diabetic? What if you were my husband, who spent 4 years waiting for a kidney transplant, fighting off dialysis, and then discovered that unlike the other parts of the country in New England, you don't start qualifying for a kidney transplant until you actively start dialysis. He discovered he had wasted 4 years of his life. What if he had then said, that's it? I know I'm going blind, I am losing my kidneys, I'm a type 1 diabetic, I'm not going to take my insulin. Now I am terminally ill, and I go to my doctor. Is he given a prescription? What about someone else with a theoretically treatable, but when not treated, incurable disease, says, I can't do this anymore. I'm tired of taking the anti-rejection drugs or whatever. Are we to say to them, go ahead and do it, and then miss out on what may turn out to be a quality of life? In my husband's case, he did go on. He was able to see my younger son married. He was able to reconcile with his youngest daughter from whom he'd been estranged. I fear, had this been available, and he would have said, no, I'm not depressed, I'm of sound mind, I just can't do this anymore, that he would have taken that way out. And I don't want any other family member to have to go through something like that. We must be able to embrace the people we love, assure them that we'll be there for them, and be with them in, yes, a terrible, terrible situation. No one wants to see a parent suffer, a husband suffer, a child suffer, but that's where our humanity must come forward as we embrace them and let them know they will not be left alone.
Well, thank you for that, and I think you make a number of valid points. First of all, the support from family members is very important, and the concept of embracing them is something I think we all endorse as well. But this is about their choice. And I think the example you give of your husband is such that with the conditions we put on in this legislation, I doubt a physician would have agreed to this given the fact that your husband might have chosen to forego treatment. If there were options within our medical knowledge that would have afforded him ability to keep going, I would argue that he would not be eligible for this because he had treatment options, and his choice to forego them would be an indication perhaps that he's not appropriately eligible. And I also I appreciate your bringing up the experiences in Europe and in Canada, because those are not this bill. And their experiences actually help us inform trying to come up with a bill that is more protective, as good as we can get. I agree there are no absolutes in medicine. We'd like to believe so. We'd like to believe it's a pure science. But there are individual differences, and it is an art. What we're talking about here is simply a matter of providing choice to the individual to make that choice on the basis of good medical input, counseling from somebody with a psychological background, and really, as well as we can determine with the lack of absolutes, that this person is at the very end of life, and this is their choice.
Thank you. I would just like to add to that the slippery slope idea, I think, is always something that concerns us with any legislation. You know that, Representative. But Oregon has had this in place for many, many years. And the Journal of Medical Ethics reported that Oregon Death with Dignity Act, and I quote, rates of assisted dying in Oregon show no evidence of heightened risk for the elderly, women, the uninsured, people with low educational status, the poor, the physically disabled or chronically ill, minors, people with psychiatric illnesses including depression, or racial or ethnic minorities compared with background populations. So we do have an example of writing good legislation that will keep us from going down that slippery slope, and that's what our intention is. So, but I think that's always something that we have to look out for.
Oh, I appreciate that, and I have read the legislation, and it does look very carefully crafted. I think it gets back to my initial point. I do think we have to be aware and beware of that potential danger, because this is a power, the power over life and death, that I think could be too easily misused to the detriment of us all.
Thank you. Are there other questions? Representative Candelora?
Thank you, Representative Cheeseman, for your testimony. I think you're adding an important perspective, noting that the AMA is still currently against assisted suicide, even though Connecticut Medical Society has chosen to be neutral. Having served on this committee with the debates, I think it's unfortunate they're not here to provide their expertise. I agree with you, taking a neutral position makes this much more difficult for us to make the best decision that we can for the public if they're not going to give their important input on medical procedures. In Oregon, getting to the slippery slope point, I think, are you familiar at all with the changes that Oregon has sought out and looked at in terms of redefining a healthcare provider so that maybe the medical profession would not be aiding?
I have read a bit about that, but I would welcome your input on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we could flush this out today, but it seems that in Oregon there's so many doctors that don't want to perform or I guess provide this procedure that they're seeking to expand this out so that non-doctors could prescribe for assisted suicide.
I would find that extraordinarily worrying, and I worry that as the legislation goes forward, well, if I only have a few weeks left to live, it's going to be too hard for me, that what is here, what are the very well-intentioned perhaps not roadblocks, perhaps speed bumps along the way to ensure that this is not misused, to ensure that only those people who actively know what they're doing and who actively seek it, now this is taking too long, and my mom wanted to do it and it took 3 months and now I saw her suffer, that what stands as good legislation today will be watered down.
And are you familiar at all in Oregon where the insurance companies are potentially denying procedures?
I had heard of one instance in which a woman in late-stage cancer was not given treatment but told she had the right to physician-assisted suicide.
And you also spoke to the mental health piece to this legislation. Currently right now it provides the attending physician to determine whether or not mental health should be incorporated into the decision making. And over the years, I know we have heard from our from psychiatrists and different social workers who have talked about how people who are choosing to go down this path almost always should have some sort of mental health counseling, because the decision not only is so grave and final, but it almost necessarily presupposes the fact that there could be depression or other factors that are driving that decision, because it's not a natural inclination to want to end your life. So, in Section 8, though, we have this in the opposite way, in which the doctor gets to determine whether or not you should have some sort of mental health review. Do you believe if this legislation was to go forward, it may be more important to require that every individual that's seeking assisted suicide should have to have some sort of evaluation and a conversation with medical experts that are in that field for counseling?
I would hope so, because again, and again, what is it? Hard cases make bad law. I have a dear friend whose husband was diagnosed with a very advanced stage of kidney cancer, underwent numerous treatments, surgeries at one stage because of a wound that wouldn't heal. Basically, they had given up hope on him, and he admitted if he had had the opportunity, he would have taken his own life. And it would have been clinically, on the cards. Well, fast forward 3 or 4 years, and he's recovered. They've made numerous trips, all over the world, welcome new grandchildren. I guess that is, again, one of my, biggest concerns about this, that people in times of despair, and again, with a clinical diagnosis, yes, this person genuinely, in our best clinical opinion, this person is going to be, dead in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, that they improve. There are, and I won't call them miracles, but because of medicine and because of the unknown nature of the lifespan that we all have, that they will be foregoing that wonderful experience, that life, that time with their loved ones, that time of high quality, because at a very low point, at a time when on the surface, yes, it looks like this, we've written you off. And you can't go back from that. That's it. That's done. That's what I fear.
Thank you. I want to thank you for your testimony, for your personal experiences, because I think that is important to hear. There is so much hope that we hear and so much positive that we hear out of people's endurance and perseverance. And it's part of the equation, I think, that we should always be considering. And I get concerned when I do see, a state like Oregon, continuing down that slippery slope to make this more and more accessible. And so thank you for your testimony today.
Thank you, Representative.
Representative Arnone?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for your testimony. Do you believe there is any circumstances for Aiden dying?
Me personally?
Yes. Would you accept any circumstances? Do you know of any that you would agree with?
I personally know. I think we have done so much with the hospice movement and so much with knowing how to best care for people at the end of their lives. I accept that other people may differ. That's
Thank
why
you.
we're here. That's why you're having this public hearing.
Any other questions or comments from the committee members? Representative McCarty?
Good morning, Representative Cheeseman. It's good
Good
to see
morning.
you here today. And mine is more or less a comment. I just want to thank you for taking the time to come here this morning and I actually printed off your testimony because it's very comprehensive and it shows a lot of research that you really put into this. And in your opinion, because I think the ultimate goal for all of us is at the end of life that we want compassion, comfort, and care. And in your research through hospice and the other centers, do you believe that everyone in their last stages of life, that they're receiving that care and that they're comforted? And then finally, the other piece, in your research, and you mentioned Canada and some other places, has there been an increase in assisted helping terminally ill people end life?
Yes. Well, touching on the hospice, yes, I think the only problem with hospice is people don't access it soon enough. I think the average stay or the median stay was 24 days. I think you need to, once you receive that diagnosis, you need to reach out to hospice because they can do so much both in terms of emotional and spiritual support, but physical support, true palliative care, easing the symptoms, really good pain control. I know with some of the legislation that's been passed here to deal with the opioid crisis, there have been concerns that for that end of stage, the true pain, we don't want to put up roadblocks that prevent people from getting that care. But I think they do such a wonderful job at it, at such a very hard and painful part of life, but they do it in a way so that they help the family and the dying person reach that wanted conclusion in an embraced and sheltered way. And with regard to an increase, yes, as I cited the research in 2017, 25% of all the deaths in the Netherlands were as a result of physician-assisted suicide. And there have been cases in which, it's certainly in Belgium and the Netherlands, if you receive a diagnosis of dementia, you can request assisted suicide once your condition worsens. Well, there was a horrific case recently. A woman had requested assisted suicide upon receiving a diagnosis of Alzheimer's. Her doctor and her family determined her dementia was becoming too far gone. She had no quality of life left. They had to actively subdue her to administer the fatal dose. And I realize we're not talking active euthanasia here, and I believe this committee has no desire to see us go down that road. But I worry that, so, you know, I worry. I worry, and I'm sure we all worry, and we want to do what's best for our citizens at all stages of their life, and particularly at that incredibly difficult end of life.
Again, thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Representative Claire DeStitria.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative, for your testimony. I think it's important for us as a committee to see all sides, and there may be an option or a side of it that you've never seen before. But one of my questions is, for me personally, I have a living will. So that seems to take care of that aspect of it, meaning I'm not going to be kept alive by any artificial means. So if I'm suffering, I'm at that point, then my living will would take care of that for me.
I think it does in terms, you know, if you get to the point you don't want to be put on a ventilator, you don't want forced nutrition or something like that. But I accept that if you're, you know, the reason you're choosing this is because you don't want to lose control over your functions, you don't want to be in terrible pain. I'm not sure a living will necessarily addresses all of that. But I agree, everybody should have a living will, everybody should have a durable power of attorney, a healthcare power of attorney. So all of you listening there, if you haven't done it, go do it. But I mean, there are many things that we have to think about as we think about not only the end of our lives, but our parents' lives. Make sure you know your loved one's passwords and any safe combinations. Believe me, it'll make your life much simpler later on. But getting back to your point, I think certainly the way this legislation is contemplated, it would not necessarily address everything that you would outline in a living will.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other questions or comments from committee members? Thank you so much, Representative, for your testimony.
Well, thank you so much for your time and your very good questions today.